I'm not quite sure what it is about airplanes and wedding receptions, although I'm willing to bet it has something to do with the altitude and the alcohol involved in both cases. But in those situations, I have found that the Roman collar becomes a bit of a magnet for those who have fallen away from the church. Those are the people who most likely are to approach me. And often, it might shock you, they're not coming to pick a fight with me about the church or one of her teachings. I found that to rarely be the case. More often than not, those people approach me on the airplanes or at the wedding receptions because they want to tell their story. They want to share with someone exactly why they fell away from the faith or from the church. And often my sense is that they're sharing that story because they're looking for someone to talk them back into the faith and back in the church. That's really what they're hoping for, what they're longing for. More often than not, their stories, as I said, don't involve doctrines or teachings of the church. More often than not, the stories they tell involve the people, the members of the church. And so I'll hear stories about how they were hurt or offended or harmed by someone in the church. But more common is the story of them sharing about people they knew, including leaders in the church, but people they knew in the church who professed one thing on Sunday and lived something radically different the rest of the week. That they didn't live up or try even to live up to the faith that they professed. And it was that hypocrisy that turned them off, that led them to fall away from the church. And judging from today's gospel, it shouldn't surprise us that's probably one of the main reasons that people fall away from Christ and fall away from the church, because there's a problem even in Jesus' day. Jesus in the gospel is taking on the believers of his day, but especially the leaders, for preaching one thing and then striving to live something very different in their lives. Because if we listen closely, he doesn't challenge them so much for failing, he challenges them for not even trying. Again, they preach one thing, but then they knowingly, intentionally live something else in their lives. And that's the critique, the stinging critique he makes of many of the believers and especially the leaders in the faith in his day. And it certainly is played out in the stories that I have heard. Many of the stories that I have heard involve leaders in the church, including many times, of course, priests. And as a priest, to hear the story of someone who fell away from the church because of how they were mistreated or saw a bad example of a priest always pains me in a particular way. I don't enjoy hearing those stories, and I always try to apologize, and I certainly know that we priests must do a better job of living up to the amazing vocation that has been entrusted to us and given to us. It's a real blessing, but we have to live up to that blessing, and we have to carry it out faithfully in service of you and in service of God. But also, to be fair, not all the stories I hear about priests, in fact, a good number of them, many of them, involve these people's fellow parishioners in the pew. It was their brothers and sisters in the pew who either mistreated them or harmed them or offended them, or the ones who were basically being hypocritical in the way they lived their lives. And that's what turned them off or led them away from Christ in their lives. And that's why I think it's fairly safe to say that there's nothing, probably nothing, that leads or draws people more away from Christ than Christians. There's nothing that draws people more away from Christ than Christians, whether they're ordained, religious, or lay, not living up to the faith we professed, not trying with all our heart, mind, and soul to live out this faith that we cherish and that we profess together. That's what becomes the big obstacle for others in coming to Christ. Again, especially when we're intentionally not living it out. Because in the stories I've heard, most of those people were willing to give us, those who live and practice our faith, a certain break. They understand that we're human. They understand that we're going to make mistakes from time to time in trying to live up to the ideal of our faith. But what they have no tolerance for, what Jesus in the gospel has no tolerance for, and what we as believers should have no tolerance for whatsoever, is to profess one thing and then to intentionally live out something else in our lives. That's the hypocrisy that becomes a scandal. That's the hypocrisy that leads people away from Christ. Not human weakness, not human stumbling, but outright hypocrisy when we profess one thing and seek to live something else in our daily lives. And so for all of us who practice our faith regularly, these readings and these stories are a sobering reminder for us of how important it is for us to live our faith out fully, to hold nothing back in trying to follow and live out our faith on a daily basis in our lives. Because otherwise, again, we'll become that stumbling block, that obstacle that will draw people away from Christ. The good news, though, right, and there's good news in these stories as well, too. The good news is that when we try to live our faith out, when we try to be authentic and faithful to living the faith we profess, then there's nothing that draws people more to Christ than Christians. When we try to live out our faith faithfully, there's nothing that draws people more to Christ than Christians. This was the great story I got to see how play out time and time again when I was a baby priest, a young priest, at St. John Vianney Parish in Goodyear, Arizona. It was my first assignment, and one of my great tasks as the parochial vicar was to be in charge of the RCIA and RICA programs in English and Spanish. At St. John Vianney, we had around 50 to 70 adults each year who would come looking for baptism or looking for their sacraments to be in full communion with the Catholic Church. 50 to 70 every year. And at the beginning of the year, we would always sit down and interview them individually to hear their stories. It was a lot of time, it took a couple days, but I always looked forward to it because my particular joy and pride as the parochial vicar of the parish was to hear that in almost all of these stories, the central character, the key player, was one of our parishioners. Whether it was someone's fiance, whether it was another family member, whether it was a co-worker or a neighbor, or in some of the most powerful stories, a stranger they met on the street, someone they ran into the gas station, who lived their faith, who was generous in such a way that it drew them, it attracted them to Christ and to His church, and they wanted to come to see what this thing we call faith and our Catholic faith was all about. It was a great joy to sit there and hear those stories and see that St. John Vianney had such a big RCIA program precisely because our parishioners were living their faith, and that witness was drawing people to Christ. If we listened closely to the second reading, that was in many ways the strategy that St. Paul lived when he was trying to be an apostle. And we often in the church look at St. Paul as being the greatest apostle or the greatest evangelist of all time because of all the people who converted to Christ because of him, all the churches that were founded because of him. But I think when we think of St. Paul being a great apostle, we often think of him being a great preacher, and that was through the power of his preaching that he converted so many souls to Christ. But if we listened closely to today's tender letter that he's writing to the Thessalonians, he reveals that his strategy, the secret to his success, was a little different. He says his secret in converting people to Christ wasn't so much the power of his preaching, but the depth of his love. The success of St. Paul as an apostle wasn't so much about the power of his preaching, but the depth of his love. Because he tells the Thessalonians, we had such affection for you. He's compared himself to a nursing mother. We've had such affection for you that we were determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our very selves as well. How beautiful is that? And St. Paul says he was determined not just to share the gospel of God, not just the teachings of Christ, not just the story of his life, death, and resurrection, but he was also determined, bent on sharing with these people his very self, loving them, not just preaching to them, not just teaching them, but entering into their lives, getting to know their joys and their sorrows, their dreams and their fears. And in that love relationship, giving himself to them in such a way that they were able to receive Christ and be drawn by him into the family of the church. It's an important reminder for all of us because we have that same task, that same mission to be evangelizers, to be apostles. Hopefully we all know that our current Holy Father, Pope Benedict XVI, has made a key part of his pontificate the new evangelization, which is this effort on behalf of the church to spread the good news of Christ in our society. Because if we're honest, today our society still knows the name of Jesus, but they don't know Jesus. They know his name, but they don't know who he is. They don't know his love. They don't know his mercy. They don't know the gift of salvation that he offers us. I'm sure every one of us here can think of many people, maybe immediate family members, brothers, sisters, children, extended family, neighbors, co-workers, people who are involved in our activities with us, who really don't know Jesus, the real Jesus. Maybe that's because they never went to church, or maybe that's because they went to church and had a bad experience and fell away. All those people need to hear the good news preached to them, and we are the ones to preach that good news, to share Christ with them. But if we're going to do that effectively, if we're going to really draw them to Christ, we have to take the same strategy that St. Paul did. We have to be willing to give of ourselves. It's not enough to buy them a Bible. It's not enough to give them a copy of the Catechism. It's not enough to tell them what time RCIA starts at the parish or when confessions are on Saturday morning. That's not enough. If we really want to draw them to Christ, we have to be willing to give ourselves to them. We have to be willing to enter into their lives, not keep them at arm's distance away, because at times they can be a little high maintenance. At times it can be a little difficult to enter into them with the pains they've experienced, the sorrows they've gone through, the struggles and doubts that they're wrestling with. It can be easier to keep them at arm's distance. But if we do so, they'll never meet Christ. We have to be willing, with great affection, to give ourselves to them, to enter into those pains, those hurts, those sorrows, as well as their joys, their hopes, and their dreams. Giving ourselves to them so that love, a loving relationship, can be built. Because when we give ourselves to them in love, we give them Christ. We give them Christ. That's not to say that we are Christ. We're certainly not. We have our human weaknesses and our stumblings. But when we faithfully seek to follow Christ, when we try to live out his teachings, we become his presence in the world. He tells us, even to the point that whoever receives you receives me. Whoever receives us receives Christ, despite our weaknesses, despite our stumblings, when we faithfully try to follow him and when we give ourselves to others in love. That's the very good news that's brought all of us here today. And that's the good news that we are called to share, whether it be on an airplane, at a wedding reception, at our dinner table, in our office, around the water cooler, at the gas station, waiting for the bus. We're called to share and to be that good news for others so that they can be drawn to Christ and know the love and the mercy and the salvation that is only his.